There are days when the silence is so heavy, it feels like a physical weight pressing down on your chest. For her, that silence had become a constant companion. She moved through her life like a ghost in her own home. The vibrant colors of her personality faded to a muted gray. She would look in the mirror and not recognize the woman staring back. The eyes, once bright with dreams and laughter, were now hollow, holding a deep, settled exhaustion that sleep could no longer fix. Her name was Clara, but lately she wasn't sure who that person was anymore. It felt like a name belonging to someone else, someone from a distant past who was full of life, who had ambitions and a clear sense of self. That woman was gone, replaced by this shell who performed the functions of daily life on autopilot. Get up, go to work, smile when spoken to, come home, stare at the wall, go to bed. Repeat. The world outside continued its frantic pace, but inside, everything had slowed to a crawl. Conversations felt like they were happening underwater, the words muffled and distant. Laughter from friends sounded foreign. A language she no longer understood. She'd nod and offer a weak smile, but the effort was draining. It was easier to retreat, to build walls around herself, made not of bricks, but of silence and excuses. I'm just tired, she'd say, a simple phrase that held the crushing weight of her reality. But it wasn't just tiredness. It was a profound sense of loss. A loss of joy, of purpose, of connection. She was adrift in a vast, quiet ocean, with no land in sight. Her apartment, once a sanctuary filled with books, art, and memories, now felt like a cage. The unfinished painting on the easel gathered dust, a monument to a passion that had died. The guitar in the corner hadn't been touched in months, its strings silent, hooves like air. Each object was a painful reminder of the person she used to be, the person she felt she had failed. She would sit on her sofa for hours, the television off, the room filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of her own heart. The loneliness was an ache that started in her bones and radiated outwards, a coldness that no blanket could warm. She wasn't just alone, she was profoundly lonely, disconnected from herself. Most of all, this was her rock bottom, a quiet, desolate place where hope seemed like a cruel joke. Then, one morning, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden bolt of lightning or a grand epiphany. It was small, almost imperceptible, as the pale morning light filtered through her blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. She saw a tiny dust mote dancing in the sunbeam. She watched it for a long time, this insignificant particle floating and turning, existing simply because it was, and in that moment, a quiet thought surfaced. Just one thing. It wasn't a promise of happiness or a plan for a new life. It was just a whisper of a command. Just do one thing. So, se did. She got out of bed and, instead of slumping onto the sofa, she walked to the sink and drank a full glass of water. It was nothing. And yet, it was everything. The next day, she did it again. Water, and then she made her bed. The sheets were still messy, but the comforter was pulled up. It was a tiny act of order in a world of chaos. These were not steps toward a dramatic transformation. They were acts of survival. They were a quiet rebellion against the inertia that had consumed her. Each small action was a flicker of resistance, a refusal to completely disappear into the grayness. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to build a routine. The routine was her anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. It started with waking up at the same time every day. No matter how much her body and mind screamed for the oblivion of sleep, she would go for a walk, just around the block at first. Her legs felt heavy, her breath short. Some days, the thought of putting on her shoes felt like climbing a mountain. Motivational. She sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, and cried, overwhelmed by the sheer effort it took. But she would wipe her tears, take a deep breath, and open the door. The fresh air on her face, the feeling of the pavement under her feet, became a small, daily victory. She started saying no. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done. No to social events that she knew would drain her. No to extra projects at work that would push her past her breaking point. No to the inner voice that told her she was being selfish or lazy. Each no was a boundary being drawn, a line in the sand that said, my well-being matters. It felt unnatural and uncomfortable. She lost some friends who didn't understand, but the space created by those boundaries gave her something she desperately needed: room to breathe. Healing wasn't a straight line. There were days she fell back into old patterns, spending the entire weekend in bed, the silence screaming at her again. The self-doubt would creep back in, whispering that she was a failure, that this was all pointless. But now, there was a difference. The next morning, she would get up and drink her glass of water. She would make her bed. She would go for her walk. She learned to give herself grace. A bad day was just a bad day, not a confirmation of her worthlessness. It was a data point, not a destination. She was learning to trust herself again, not because she was perfect, but because she kept showing up, even after she fell. Months passed, turning into a year. The changes weren't dramatic to an outsider, but to her, they were monumental. Her walks became longer, turning into runs through the park. The rhythm of her feet hitting the ground became a form of meditation, a beat that drowned out the anxious thoughts. One afternoon, she found herself standing in front of the dusty easel. She didn't feel a sudden rush of inspiration, but a quiet curiosity. She wiped it down, squeezed a small amount of blue paint onto a palette, and made a single stroke on the canvas. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She was no longer just surviving. She was creating again. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was different now. The hollowness in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet strength. There were still lines of tiredness, but they were etched by effort, not by despair. She wasn't the bubbly, carefree person she had been before, and she realized she didn't want to be. That person was a memory. This new woman was forged in silence and struggle. She was more grounded, more deliberate. Her confidence wasn't loud or performative. It was a deep internal knowing. It was the quiet assurance that came from keeping promises to herself, from facing her own darkness and choosing to find the light, one small step at a time. She still had quiet days. She still valued her solitude, but the silence was no longer a weight. It was a space for reflection, a sanctuary where she could hear her own voice clearly. She had rebuilt herself, not with a grand blueprint, but with the small, consistent acts of self-respect. She had found her strength not by shouting, but by listening to the whisper within. She was not perfect. She was not fixed. She was simply herself again, stronger, wiser, and finally at peace in her own company. And as she looked forward, she knew the journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, she was no longer afraid of the road ahead. She was ready to walk it. As weeks turned into months, Clara discovered that rebuilding wasn't just about doing the right things. It was about unlearning the voices that had lived inside her for years. Voices that told her she had to be strong all the time, that resting was weakness, that slowing down meant falling behind. These voices didn't sound cruel, they sounded practical, responsible, even loving. But they were relentless, and they were exhausting. At work, she began to notice how deeply this pattern ran. She was always the one who said yes. Yes to staying late. Yes to fixing problems that weren't hers. Yes to carrying emotional weight that no one else wanted. She had built her identity around being reliable, capable, indispensable. And when she finally started pulling back, the guilt hit hard. It sat in her chest like a stone. Shayin no didenti feel empowering. At first, it felt like betrayal. Betrayal of expectations. Betrayal of the image people had of her. Betrayal of the version of herself that believed her worth came from how much she could endure. There were days when she questioned everything, sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen. She wondered if this slower, quieter version of herself was actually just giving up. She worried she was becoming invisible, that she was losing her edge. The fear wasn't loud, but it was persistent. What if this isn't healing? What if this is just me settling? Those thoughts followed her home. They surfaced in the evenings. When the world finally went quiet again, she would sit on her sofa, the old loneliness tapping gently at the door of her mind. It was tempting to reopen it, to slip back into old patterns, to overwork, overthink, overextend, anything to avoid feeling unsure. Growth, she realized, wasn't always about moving forward. Sometimes it was about resisting the urge to run backward. One night, after a particularly draining day, she broke down. Not in a dramatic way. She simply sat on the floor and cried deep, silent sobs that came from a place she had ignored for years. She cried for the girl she had been trying so hard to be enough. She cried for the woman she had become, carrying expectations that were never hers to begin with. And when the tears stopped, something inside her softened. For the first time, she didn't judge herself for needing that release. She let it exist. That moment changed how she treated herself. Clara began to approach her days with curiosity instead of punishment. She paid attention to what drained her and what gave her quiet energy. She noticed how her body reacted to stress long before her mind admitted it. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, a constant sense of urgency that served no one. She started pausing, taking breaks without explaining herself, logging off on time, eating meals without distraction. These weren't dramatic acts, but they were radical in a life built on self-neglect. There were setbacks, of course. Weeks when everything felt heavy again. Mornings when getting out of bed felt just as hard as it had at the beginning. The difference now was how she responded. She didn't spiral. She didn't label herself a failure. She reminded herself of the truth she had earned through experience. Healing was not linear, and strength wasn't fragile. One difficult week didn't erase months of effort. As her inner world stabilized, her relationships began to shift. Some people drifted away, uncomfortable with her new boundaries. Others leaned in, meeting her where she was, instead of where she used to perform. Clara learned that not every connection was meant to survive growth, and that loss didn't always mean something had gone wrong. Sometimes it simply meant she was becoming more honest. Creativity returned slowly, without pressure. She painted when she felt like it. She played music without recording it or sharing it. She created for herself, not for validation, and in doing so, she rediscovered the version of joy that felt safe, not overwhelming, not fragile, but steady. It wasn't the explosive happiness she once chased. It was quieter, deeper, sustainable. There came a moment, much later, when she realized she hadn't checked the mirror in weeks, looking for proof that she was better. She no longer needed constant confirmation. Her confidence wasn't something she performed anymore. It lived in how she handled hard days, in how she spoke to herself when no one was listening, in how she chose rest without guilt and effort, without self-destruction. She understood now that her strength had never disappeared. It had just been buried under expectations, exhaustion, and fear. And rebuilding herself didn't mean returning to who she was before. It meant becoming someone new, someone who could carry both ambition and peace, someone who knew when to push and when to stop, someone who trusted herself. And with that understanding came peace, not the kind that erases struggle, but the kind that makes it manageable. Clara no longer needed her life to look a certain way to feel worthy. She no longer measured her progress by comparison or approval. She measured it by how she felt when she was alone with herself. And for the first time in years, that solitude no longer frightened her. There were still challenges ahead, unanswered questions, days-of-doubt moments when old fears would resurface. But now, they didn't define her. They passed through her, like weather. She had learned that strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about knowing how to rebuild without abandoning yourself in the process. She didn't rush toward the future anymore. She walked toward it, steady, present, grounded, carrying with her the quiet confidence of someone who had faced her own emptiness and survived it. Someone who had learned to listen instead of force, to rest instead of run, to choose herself without guilt. Clara wasn't chasing happiness. She was cultivating stability. She wasn't trying to become extraordinary. She was becoming honest, and in that honesty, she found something far more valuable than the life she once imagined. She found herself, and that, she knew now, was more than enough.